the same philosophical enigma that is occurring in free will reoccurs in the Trinity and reoccurs at the origins of the universe. It seems to be the same question and the same inescapable dilemma every single place you look. And I thought, oh, well, if the Trinity and free will are actually the same problem as the origins of the universe, then does that mean that the Trinity and free will are as rational to believe in as our own existence? So to me, this is kind of the basic grounding of my theological outlook is how can we walk through the irrational in a rational way?
Hey everyone, welcome back to the podcast. We've got another excellent episode for you today. My guest is Dr. J.D. Lyonhart. He is an assistant professor of theology and philosophy at Lincoln Christian University, and we're going to be talking about his book MonoThreeism, an absurdly arrogant attempt to answer all the problems of the last 2,000 years in one night at a pub. The subtitle's a mouthful, but it basically describes what he does in the book. It's a dialogue between two people at a pub restaurant, and a third person comes in, their server, and they get into the deep mysteries of life and the Trinity, and it's a really fun book. JD's a fun guy. He's got his own podcast, what he co-hosts, called the Spiritually Incorrect Podcast. So you can check that out. He's doing a number of other really interesting things, and I'll post links in the description, as well as links to his books. So check out his work, check out his podcast, his YouTube channel, all that good stuff. Before we jump into our conversation with JD, I just wanted to remind you about what we're doing here at the Center for Bible Study and the opportunity to support us and become a member of the center. So we are having more and more people join, which is fantastic, becoming members of the Center for Bible Study. Any monthly donation, recurring donation, whatever you feel like you want. It could be $1, $2, $3, $5, whatever you feel like is appropriate and manageable. This makes you a member for the Center for Bible Study, which means that you get access to all of our courses that we've taught in the past. We're constantly teaching 4 to 6 week courses on a whole host of topics. Our next course will be coming up in January, called The Bible for Busy People, where I'll be walking you through basics of biblical interpretation. So you can join us for that. So you get all the past classes, entrance into all the future classes. We give you a shout out on the podcast, and you get a monthly newsletter. So it's a really great deal, great way for you if you want to support the work we're doing here at the ministry. All of the donations are tax deductible. So that's a really great opportunity. You can give through the link in the description, or you just go to jessup.edu/CBS, and that will take you to our website page where there's a donation link there as well. So I encourage you to do that. Definitely encourage you, if you're interested in our next class, to consider. That will be again in January. We'll have more information coming out about that soon. Bible for Busy People. It'll be a class on biblical interpretation. All right. Well, thanks, everybody. We appreciate your support. Appreciate you here. Make sure that you have, if you haven't yet, that you've subscribed to our channel, or if you're viewing us on the podcast, please make sure you're subscribed or following the podcast. And turn on your notifications so you get all alerts when we're releasing new stuff. And please do share, like, comment. All of those things really help spread the information from this channel. So if you appreciate what we're doing here, the best thing you can do is just engage with our content and share it. That's super helpful. We really appreciate it. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump into our conversation with JD. Welcome, everybody, back to the podcast. I'm super excited today to have on Dr. J.D. Lyonhart. He's a PhD professor in theology and philosophy. We're going to be talking about his book, MonoThreeism. You're going to have to help me with the subtitle, but it's like an absurdly arrogant attempt at answering all the questions of the past 2,000 years in one night at a pub, or something like that.
That's actually pretty close. That's great.
I was trying to get it down. It was something like that, but
that's great. I'm impressed.
Yeah.
So
we're going to chat about the book. It's really, really a fun book. It was different than what I expected when I first read the title. It's really a cool, creative approach to answering or at least discussing some really complex, important questions. But first of all, JD, thanks so much for being on the show. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me.
Yeah,
Glad to be here. So
yeah.
I always love self-promotion and hearing myself talk, and if I can inflict that on the rest of humanity, I will.
We are
So
here for you for the next hour or so. You can promote away. Yes.
yeah.
Well, yeah. Before we get into the book, just to so our audience has a chance to get, the chance to get to know you a little bit. Would you give us some insight into your own journey of faith and how you became passionate about theology and philosophy?
Yeah, I as a high schooler, I was kind of just plagued with all of these questions like, does free will make sense? If it doesn't make sense, are we just robotic automatons that don't actually have freedom? And then all of our moral choices don't matter. And then the whole society falls apart and life has no meaning and all of those types of things. Um,
So
and
you
I
were
was
you
all
were one of those kids.
So I was delightful at parties. Um, and at the same time, I was always wrestling with cosmic questions, with what is the nature of the universe, ontology, where did we all come from, who created the world, who created them, what created the thing that created the thing that created the thing that created the thing. And I was just getting lost in all of these sort of philosophical problems and enigmas. But I don't think I ever thought that was something you could do vocationally, is to just get lost in those enigmas all day long. And I never really thought of myself as smart. Well, maybe a little bit, but I had multiple learning disabilities, so I never did well at school. So it wasn't until college, when a professor who did philosophy sort of took me under their wing, that I started to think, oh, hey, uh, maybe they see something there. Maybe I could do this. Maybe I'm not a total moron. And then my ego didn't need much coaxing, and I just ran all the way home with that. So yeah,
Okay. Cool. And that led you then. I trying to remember your background. I know you did your PhD at the University of Cambridge.
yeah,
What was that path like for you? How did you wind up there?
yeah. So like I was saying, I really sucked at school. In high school, there were times where I thought I wouldn't pass. Then undergrad, I still didn't have a great GPA, but I was at least doing something I was passionate about. But then with grad school, I started taking studies more seriously. I started really diving into the texts and the history and the traditions, and just got really like, let's do this.
Mm.
And so I managed to scrounge up just enough chutzpah to get into Cambridge, by the skin of my teeth. And I tricked them, and I've been tricking everybody ever since. So yeah,
All right, yeah,
they,
that's what we do as academics, right? We're all pretenders to some degree or another.
yeah,
Um, you're doing some public scholarship yourself, so I noted that you have the Spiritually Incorrect podcast. I'd love to hear just a little bit about that, and also I'm really interested in NumiNous, theology and neurodiversity,
yeah.
the center that you are heading up there, which I think is just such an important uh, topic and conversation to have, one that I hope theologians will continue to explore. So, love to hear about those two things for a minute, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, for sure. And I'll repeat the titles of them multiple times, as like promotional thing. The Spiritually Incorrect podcast is a
We're
podcast.
spiritually correct on this one, just to be
Oh, okay.
clear with everybody.
So okay, all right. Well,
Just
I'll put
kidding.
my shirt back on. No, so the Spiritually Incorrect podcast, is a podcast I co-host with Seth Hart, who just did his graduate work at Oxford under Alice McGrath, and at Durham under Simon Oliver. And basically, the goal of the podcast is to just tackle all of those questions that like mainstream Western religious people aren't really talking about, but that are just right there under the surface, and that
Hmm.
like they would love to talk about. They just hadn't realized they could, or that wasn't too inappropriate or too absurd. So we talk about pretty much everything. Like we just had an episode on ghosts. Uh, like
Nice.
an actual like, are ghosts real type of thing, but we try to do crazy subjects in a legitimate way. So we talked about ghosts, but we had an MIT professor and who's also a Pulitzer Prize winning science journalist come to talk to us about ghosts. So we
Nice.
try to strike that balance. Like we also had Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, a Cambridge biologist, come to talk to us about telepathy. Is telepathy real? He thinks
Wow.
so. And he's a
Okay.
Christian, so he has like a Christian view of telepathy. And so we just do these crazy topics.
Interesting.
We
I
also
gotta check
do
that out. Yeah, that's really
we
cool.
also do dialogues with like a lot of New Age stuff, a
Yeah.
lot of Eastern philosophy type of stuff. We've got episodes on reincarnation, all sorts of things. So, and then
Cool.
there's also more traditional
Sure.
theological subjects and like abortion, homosexuality. Like we talk about pretty much everything that's kind of uncomfortable or that people aren't talking about. So
Sounds good. Yeah. So I'll post a link to the channel for sure. That sounds great. Yeah, people should go
yeah.
check that out. What about NumiNous then? Well, I
Yeah,
want to
so
hear
the
about that.
NumiNous Institute for Faith and Neurodiversity arises kind of out of my own experience of growing up with dysgraphia, which is the lesser known sort of inverse of dyslexia. Dyslexia
Oh,
has
okay.
trouble bringing in information, whereas dysgraphia has trouble putting it back out there. My hand literally forgets how to form letters while I'm writing them. And that has implications for how I process information and put it out there and all these other things. And so that, in addition to some other disabilities, always just kind of made me question whether I was intelligent at all. And I mean, it felt like a disability growing up. Um, it's a learning disability. But once I kind of got past the initial stages of academia and into grad school and PhD, those sort of things that had once handicapped me, I realized in some ways liberated me to see the world differently than a lot of people and kind of gave me, I don't want to say a privileged perspective, but an outsider's perspective, a different way of seeing things. And I actually found that this thing wasn't just a burden, but it was a blessing. And so the NumiNous Institute arises out of that. I also have two autistic children.
Yeah.
And so we kind of just felt like, okay, this is pressing on us. We've been doing a lot of research on this because it affects me, it affects my family. And I think God created us. I mean, this is my conviction. I believe we're all made in the image of God. And so our neurodiverse ways of thinking are reflections, the little glimmers in the vast ocean off of the one who is the sun above. And so I think these different ways of perceiving God are valuable not just for neurodiverse people to claim as their own, not just for autistic or learning disabled people to claim as their own and to redeem and take hold of, but also they're valuable insights and ways of seeing things that the rest of people should be thinking about. Like our weirdness is worth hearing. You should hear it because we've had to hear all of your neurotypical ways of talking about God and thinking about religious spaces our whole lives. Your turn to listen to us, not just because we're trying to be more diverse, so hear diverse perspectives, but actually because I think we might have something to contribute, an outsider's perspective on some of these things, on who God is and theology and church spaces. So that's what the organization is about, and we offer grants for different research proposals and projects working at that intersection of neurodiversity, faith, ministry, and theology. So.
Oh, that's fantastic. I love it. I love it. It seems to me there's a lot of space for a great need for equipping churches and ministries to serve neurodiverse bodies of believers. That it's not necessarily on many pastors' radars yet, or it's on some, but not others. And even people who are aware of certain concepts may not know exactly how to go about serving people in their congregation well. So it's cool to hear that you guys are doing that, and that there's grant possibilities out there for to kind of push the ball down the road. So
well, if you want people to care about something and about your issues,
got to put money in it.
You got to throw money at them. Yeah,
that's exactly right. Money speaks. Money speaks for sure.
Yeah.
Well, okay, let's get into the book then. So MonoThreeism. What I was trying to think about, like, I'd love to just hear what was the impetus of the book for you? Hey, I just love to write a book on the Trinity in a kind of different way, right? So, well, first of all, for the audience, right, the concept of the book is it's two gentlemen at a pub, and then a third character, the pub server. She actually probably is the sharpest one of the three, but she comes in periodically with her voice as well. So it has the feel of a kind of like a modern Socratic dialogue in a sense. I don't know if that's where you're going for, but that's what I kept thinking of when I was reading the story. So it's a narrative, dialogue, conversation about the Trinity. And I'd just be curious to kind of pick your mind a little bit on, yeah, what was the impetus? Was it trying to explain the Trinity, like a cool way for explaining the Trinity to most of us who don't understand it? Or was there maybe, as with the character in the book who's struggling with faith, the kind of the absurdity of the doctrine? Was it apologetic, or what was
Yeah.
driving your desire to do this
Yeah.
project?
Well, we got into this discussion just a few minutes ago, but the theological is definitely the autobiographical here because, as I was saying, in high school, I was really wrestling with a number of questions. And I
Mm,
think uh, it first appeared as, does free will make sense? And I was wrestling through it and reading what I could, and nobody seemed to be making any sense on that topic for me. And I was kind of just to the point where I was like, well, free will doesn't make sense, so I'm not going to believe in it. But then I was also hearing about the Trinity, at church, and I was thinking, well, three and one, Father, Son, and Spirit, but also we're monotheists, and it's three, but it's also one. It's many, but it's also one. Uh, does that make sense? And
one
I
plus
never
one
really,
plus one equals one.
yeah, it didn't seem to make sense to me, and nobody I read on it was making things any clearer. So I was
Mm,
like, well, this doesn't make sense, so I'm not going to believe in it. Uh, but then I started studying and thinking about the origins of the universe, and that also didn't make sense. Anytime someone tries to explain how we got here, what caused the cause, infinite
mhm.
regression, or is it something? Anytime someone's tried to make sense of the origins of the universe, they never can make sense of it. I've never heard someone give a good to make sense of it. And so I was like, well, I guess then we don't exist. I guess I won't believe we. No, but actually, what happened there is those three problems. I'd originally tackled them in my sort of progression separately,
Okay.
but as I started to think about them in tandem together, I started to align them and realize actually this one it's not three different problems in three different contexts. It seems to almost be the same problem. The
Uh-huh.
same philosophical enigma that is occurring in free will reoccurs in the Trinity and reoccurs at the origins of the universe. It seems to be the same question and the same inescapable dilemma every single place you look. And
Uh-huh.
I thought, oh, well, if the Trinity and free will are actually the same problem as the origins of the universe, then does that mean that the Trinity and free will are as rational to believe in as our own existence? We might not be able to make sense of them, but are they as inescapable as, hey, I'm here?
Hmm.
I might not be able to explain how I got here, but I'm here, and I can't explain the Trinity or how free will work, but they do, or else we wouldn't exist to talk about it.
Right.
And I thought this was a new way to ground thinking about these things. And to me, this is kind of the basic grounding of my theological outlook: is how can we walk through the irrational in a rational way?
Hmm.
Um, and we don't have to make sense of everything, uh, but we can still hold on to things that don't quite make sense as long as we have kind of tethered it to, well, I guess in this case, the origins of the universe. But
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's
so,
great. So, yeah, a big part of the book, right, is the character Vlad taking. How do you pronounce the other guy's name? I wasn't sure. I always struggle with names. How would you pronounce it?
I mean, I guess there's no definitive way of pronouncing it. I guess I would have just said Edie.
Edie. Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
So Edie's having this faith crisis. He's done. He's not going to come preach the next day, and Vlad really needs him to preach at the chapel, right? So, um, and so the argument that a lot of the book explores is what you laid out for us, and I'd love to hear you kind of walk us through that a little bit of. The Trinity has, on its face, kind of has some absurdity to it, like the one plus one plus one equals three, and that's certainly something that people, when they object to the Christian faith, point out. Um, And Vlad's argument is that, well, the origin of our existence of the universe kind of has that same absurdity baked in. And Edie's interested. He wants to know, what does that mean? I don't know if you have any bar napkins that you can write on for us, as Vlad does in the book. And I have a coffee here. I kind of felt like I should have had at least like a couple, I don't know, a shot of whiskey or something like that before we started this conversation. But in any case, we'll make do. I've got caffeine at least. So
Yeah, I have water.
you've got water. Okay.
Is it?
Well,
Is it water?
but yeah, could you take us through that a little bit? Because I don't think it's going to be necessarily obvious to the whole audience when you say, oh, it wasn't obvious to the character Edie either, right? Like, why?
Yeah.
How are these two things similar?
Yeah. So
why should we? Because we're here, obviously. So I can be like, I can touch myself. I can feel myself. I know I'm here. I know I exist. Right. And the world's here. It exists. So how in the world are you comparing that to the Trinity? Right. Yeah. So walk us through that a little bit.
How's the enigma of the beginning of existence comparable to the enigma of the Trinity?
Yes.
Well, basically, this is going to be really fast, and if you have objections or confusions, I make it a lot clearer in the book. So buy the book, MonoThreeism.
Buy it.
But basically, when we're looking at how the universe got here, I think there's three options to explain that. The universe was either caused by becoming, by being, or some combination of both. What I mean by becoming is everything that becomes something else, by change, time, cause and effect, that sort of thing. So when we look at the world around us, there's this sort of temporal process underway, right? And the question is, how did we get here? How did this start? Well, what caused this process? You can say, well, there was something before this. What caused me? My parents. What caused my parents? Well, their parents. What caused their parents? Their parents, their parents, their parents' parents. What caused the species? Well, What caused the planet? What caused the galaxy? What caused the universe? Well, God did. But what caused God? And maybe that just keeps going back for infinity with an infinite chain of temporal becoming explaining itself on into infinity. One cause within time explains another cause within time, explains another cause within time. So that's becoming explaining itself in an infinite chain of just one thing in becoming, explaining another thing in becoming, explaining another thing in becoming. The problem with that is I think infinity just doesn't make sense. I think mathematicians have found clever ways to work around it and incorporate it into their calculations, but I don't think they've ever been able to make sense of it or understand how it works on any deeper underlying level. So just there's sort of an intuitive sense to finite minds that infinity doesn't make sense, but to spell out this nonsensicalness just ever so slightly more, if an infinite period of time had to have occurred before this moment in time, would we ever have gotten to this moment in time?
Right.
Is it even possible for us to traverse infinity to reach this moment? If I told you I'd give you a cheeseburger after infinity, would you ever get the cheeseburger? No, you wouldn't get the cheeseburger because an infinite period of time would have had to have occurred first. And if an infinite chain of time of becoming before this moment exists, that means we would have had to have crossed infinity to get to this point in time, in which case we'd never reach this moment in time because you can't traverse an infinite through finite addition. Doesn't matter how much you do 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1, Dracula is never going to age to infinity because finite addition can never reach the infinite.
Right.
Additionally, there's other issues with infinity that have been pointed out throughout history, and we can get into those, but that gets more and more speculative and difficult. And I try to spell those out in a fun, playful way in the book, hopefully.
Yeah.
But anyways, explaining becoming in this infinite chain leads to absurdity and nonsensicalness. It doesn't make sense. So the becoming option, where time explains time, where becoming explains becoming, doesn't work. Which is one of the reasons why theologians and philosophers have tried to say, okay, what caused the universe isn't another thing in becoming, Rather, it's something that's outside of becoming, something that doesn't begin or end, doesn't become or go through process, something that is atemporal, something that is outside of time, something that is eternal, something that is not becoming, but is being. Eternal, timeless, atemporal, unchanging, processing eternity. And this is, you see the foundations of the cosmological argument and all of those types of things here. The timeless is what grounds and causes time. You can't have an infinite chain of becoming stretching back. Eventually you have to hit rock bottom in the timeless. And a timeless thing doesn't need a cause of its existence because it's outside of time. It never began to exist. It just always eternally has. And so everything that begins to exist in time needs a cause of its existence. If my face turns like this, it needs a cause. I slapped it. That's what it caused it to occur. But if something is outside of time, it doesn't need a cause of its existence because it never began to exist, so it doesn't need anything to begin to bring it into existence. Right. And so in order to get out of the infinite regression of becoming, people appeal to timeless being. Becoming is in time, but being is outside of time. And so being can cause becoming. And you can't then say, oh, what caused being? Because being is timeless. It never began to exist. It just eternally is. And so it's rock bottom. It doesn't infinitely go back. Nope, you've hit rock bottom. That's the eternal, timeless foundation that never began to be, but just sheerly is. It's not becoming, it's being. And so people will often say, well, being is what explains, and with a cosmological argument, you'll have religious people saying, therefore, an eternal, timeless God created the universe. And that's why other created things within becoming can't just infinitely explain it. We need being to explain it. And I mean, that makes sense for a while, but I don't think that makes sense ultimately either. Because how can a timeless being begin to create the universe? If a timeless being is outside of time, he can't begin, he or she or it, I'm not going to get into that today, cannot begin.
Actually, I'm gonna ask you about gender language later, so that's coming.
Yeah. How can something that is timeless begin to create in time? Because as soon as you say begin, you've reintroduced time. You've brought becoming back into things in order to explain becoming. And so you're just bringing the problem back in. A timeless being is not just an infinite being that's always been doing things for an infinite regression of time, because then you're back to the infinity of becoming. A timeless being is almost like a frozen statue, just timelessly stuck in place. And so if it's causing something or doing something, it's eternally doing that. If I'm throwing this ball eternally, the ball is eternally being thrown and it's eternally being caught. If a cause is eternal, its effect is eternal because it's eternally causing it. And so if God is being and created the universe would have to be eternal as well. Because if the cause is eternally doing things, then the effect is eternally being caused. In which case, becoming, time, process, change, those are illusions. This thing we think of as time isn't real. Everything is eternal. It's always existed, and so time isn't real. And so basically, it doesn't make sense to say being creates becoming because being can't begin to do anything. And so being can't explain the universe either. It can't make sense of how we got here. Now, that's where the both option comes in. People try to kind of sneakily combine the two and say both of them. And if something were allowed to be both, if an eternal timeless being could begin to create in becoming, then yeah, a timeless being could have a temporal effect. If somehow being and becoming were wedded into one entity at the same, then yeah, a timeless being could have a temporal effect and create the universe. But that would be a contradiction. For then you're saying that time and timelessness are united in one. The atemporal is also temporal. Being is also becoming. The uncaused is also able to cause. And I mean, in effect, a lot of people have tried to say that, but I think the problem is that's always going to be a contradiction. At one point or another, for those two things to meet, you're going to just have to fundamentally break down logic to say that the timeless is also in time. So how do we have this timeless being that's also bound up with temporal becoming and creates the universe? I don't know. But if that option were a possibility, then that would explain why we got here. Sadly, it's a contradiction.
Hmm.
But then when you look at these options, being, becoming, both, I think they're pretty exhaustive. I don't know what other options there are. There are thousands of different creation stories, but I'm not sure if any of them really get out of being one of those three.
Yeah.
Because
a lot of the creation stories too aren't really directly trying to answer those questions either, right? So
they're not.
they're kind of just yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think at the heart of it, if you want to restate it as logic, either something inside of time caused the universe, something outside of time caused the universe, or something that is both. Like
Mm-hmm.
either A, non-A, or both A and non-A. It's actually pretty exhaustive, logically speaking. So I basically argue in the book, we don't have it's not even possible to have an account of how the universe came to be that makes sense, because all three options do not make sense.
Yeah.
But this is where I begin to parallel it to the Trinity. When we're looking at the Trinity, how do you have this timeless, eternal, transcendent Father who's so transcendent that if you gaze at him directly, you'll die? Who is above and beyond time and space, such that idolatry is the capital offense in ancient Judaism? Do not picture him like a created entity the way you picture other things. How do you have this eternal, timeless father figure in the clouds who is also one with this temporal incarnate Christ, for whom all things were supposed to be made? How can this Father of eternal being be one with this temporal incarnate entity of becoming who even dies? That's the scandal of Christianity. How is this thing down here one with the being up there? It doesn't make sense. It doesn't work. And where does the Spirit, this unity, as Augustine called the kiss between being becoming, the kiss between, I just gave the game away, the kiss between Father and Son, how does this unity that proceeds from both play into the whole thing as well? And as you're kind of restating the Trinitarian issue, you kind of begin to realize, oh, it's kind of the same problem. How does this eternal, timeless, transcendent father figure of classical theism, how is that entity one with this temporal, incarnate, human Christ who dies, who has flesh, who's embodied, who's in time? And how are those things united in the Spirit? And you realize, well, it's the same problem of how being and becoming relate. So I can't explain how being and becoming work in the Trinity to come together as one, but it's the same problem when you talk about the origins of the universe, because nobody has a good explanation of how the timeless relates to time or how eternity relates to the universe.
Hmm.
And so my inability to explain the Trinity is the same inability of anyone to explain the existence of anything at all. And so it's not a problem that I, as a Christian, have to account for with apologetics, because atheists have the exact same problem baked into their system. So do Muslims, who are constantly saying, like, your Trinity doesn't make sense. And I'm like, yeah, it doesn't make sense. But you're not getting around the problem. It's there in your creation story, too. No one's escaping this. We're all stuck here together in this same problem. So, yeah, that's kind of the basic foundation of the argument. And then in the book, I explore, like, well, are these really that good of a parallel, being and becoming and, the Trinity? And I argue they really are. Being can't create anything without becoming, because it can't begin to do anything, right? So it's only through becoming that all things can be made. Being might be grounding becoming. It has to, it's the being from which it draws, but nothing is made except through becoming.
Mm-hmm.
Just as through Jesus all things are made. And I think you can just keep drawing these parallels because they're really everywhere. And I constantly had people telling me I was imposing philosophical categories onto the text. But I guess I feel like logic is imposing a philosophical category, a deeply human one, not just a Greek one, but a human category onto the text as well. And what this framework allowed me to do was to just let the text be what it seemed to be saying. Yeah, Jesus, this guy down here, is one with God up there. Full stop.
Hmm.
And the enigma you try to have between, say, process theology and classical theology, I get why you guys keep having this problem, but you're not going to solve it because it's the problem. It's
Hmm.
it's the same problem that we're dealing with in cosmology. It doesn't make sense, but neither does your existence, and so it's just as rational to believe in the Trinity, even if you don't understand it, as it is to believe in your own existence.
Yeah. So everybody, JD is brilliant, and secondly, this is a great reason why I became a biblical scholar and not a theologian, because all I do is mess around with texts all day long. I'm just kidding.
All the
Yeah,
world
no,
is a text.
yeah, yeah, exactly, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can pretend that I'm just doing my objective historical stuff and keep going. Yeah, so no, I think that's really helpful. Maybe just to give people a couple hooks to hang on, and of course they have to read the book to follow along with the full argument, but
Hopefully the book is less obtuse and abstract and all over the place than I am. That was the point about embodying it in a conversation at a pub.
yeah, it's great. Well,
It
and the idea that, it kind of reminds of the need for community and conversation rather than just thinking about these things on our own, right? We sharpen each other as we wrestle with questions. When you're using becoming to describe the incarnate Christ, um, just for clarity's sake, that becoming would also um, attend to the pre-incarnate Christ as well, correct? Because the second person of the Trinity is the one through whom, so the Father
well,
through
yeah.
the Son creates, right?
Yes, I think it would. And yet, because they're one in this enigma, that doesn't mean that Christ began to exist.
Hmm.
Because, yes, he's becoming, but he's also somehow one with being in a way that we don't understand. And so he's becoming, but he's also eternal.
Hmm.
And so you can't say he's created. All you can
Hmm.
say is he's begotten,
Hmm.
which is
Yes.
exactly what
What the
theology
creed? That's
got
what the
to.
creed. That's what the creeds say. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yep.
but
Yep.
I've tried to get there using philosophy, which you're not
Yeah.
supposed to be able to do. But I think that's because we always try to make philosophy strictly rational instead of embracing the absurdity of the universe itself. I think reason
Yeah.
oversteps when it makes more sense than reality.
I like that. Yeah, I like that a lot. Well, and I love that. That's my favorite kind of way um, of just engaging these issues. Is I think sometimes people come up with objections based on the rational, and yeah, I mean we want to be rational, but it's helpful to kind of step back and recognize that on like the really big stuff, there's like mystery and absurdity behind the biggest questions, and I think that's one thing you show us really well in the book. So it doesn't. It's not like a. It's not an apologetics argument for the Trinity insofar as saying like, here's text X, Y, and Z. These prove the Trinity, and you're an idiot if you don't believe in the Trinity or something like that. That's not what JD's doing. It's more of like kind of exploring the deep mysteries of existence and inviting us to recognize that the mystery of the Trinity is of a similar kind. And so I don't know. I mean, our life in many ways is ultimately rooted in mystery, and I think some of us have an easier time accepting that than others. But I found it to be a really compelling argument and an engaging format to present it in. So, yeah, thanks for sharing that.
I terrified everyone away.
No, 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 no. The book pairs well with different forms of alcohol. We can say that.
I will neither confirm nor deny that.
um, so obviously, a lot of the book is focused on exploring the mystery of the Trinity and this parallel argument to the mystery of existence. But you get into other topics as well as they move on in the conversation. I think one that's well, I want to actually touch on two that I think will be most most interesting to the audience, because I just think they're two of the most common discussion points today in our world. The first of which is when it comes to how we talk about God. Um, Classic theism, as you mentioned, typically uses masculine language, and masculine language, we could point, is, it's rooted in text, having the father son metaphor, for example. Although there are places in Scripture where God is presented as feminine. That's by far the minority. So, how do we think about gender with classical Trinitarianism, and what do you get into in the book in terms of, like,
Yeah.
spelling out the implications of that? Because I mean, I don't know if you know Amy Peeler, but she wrote a book on women in the Trinity, and what was it, women in the gender of God.
Yeah.
And we had her on the show to talk about it. Great book. And some of the comments, it's so funny. Like, she talks through in a very kind of classical Trinitarian way about gender language, and just to even talk about some issues with the father language and how it gets extended, gets some people really upset and nervous. Like, people think we're doing, like, injustice to the biblical text or the tradition. There's such a baked in assumption that God is a man,
Yeah.
that people think that's actually what's being faithful to the Christian tradition, is God is a man. So anyway, I'd love to hear your thinking about that. Anything you want to share?
Yeah. Well, I would say that a lot of it comes down to theological language. Do we think that the language we use to talk about God functions in theological conversations in the exact same way as it functions in normal daily conversations? So is saying God is Father, is that an analogy? Or is that literally God is a male father? And I think a lot of people want to say, well, that's literal. God's a male father. And I'm like, okay, well, if we're going to say it's literal, does God have a penis? Does God actually have a penis, like an actual genitalia? And most of the time, they'll usually back off a bit and be like, I don't think God has an actual penis. And I'll say, okay, so there is a degree of analogousness in that term already, even in the way you're using it. And so we're already beginning to pick and choose. And you might think that the picking and choosing you've done makes sense. Okay, God doesn't have a penis, but there's a masculine energy. There's big God energy to him. Like there's
That's it.
know, but and I understand. I mean, that's kind of the way that most people have settled in to the analogousness of it. Is God's still masculine in energy, but not, he has an actual, But I think it's important to say, okay, so you've already picked and chosen how far you're going to let the analogy go. So if someone else is going to come along and say, well, maybe it's more analogous in other ways. Maybe the fatherness is just a way of saying, hey, the ancient Jewish father figure, which within that culture was the leader, is kind of a helpful analogy at that time for saying God is leader, or God is up there, or God, as opposed to saying God is literally male. And I don't want to overdo that, but I also want to take that seriously as a plausible way of applying analogy. And to bring it back to the text, so I'm not just this wishy-washy progressive who just wants to say whatever I want to say, which I know some people are concerned about. Something I've come back to over and over again is the Imago Dei. In Genesis, it says God made them in the divine image. In the image of God, God created them. Male and female, God created them. Maleness and femaleness is the very first thing that is said in the immediate context of the Imago Dei. The sentence is literally without ... or a break between them. In the image of God, God created them. Male and female, God created them. That's the sentence word for word in Genesis. So maleness and femaleness is the first thing put in that context of the Imago Dei. And I'm not terribly comfortable with anyone who tries to decide what the male and female essence is. That's be above my pay grade. But I do wonder if maleness and if men and women are both made in the image of God, that means there must be something about us that without us here would be lost of our understanding of God. There must be not just something masculine, but something feminine in the divine image, such that without women bearing that image, we would not understand something about God. There'd be a lack, a hole in our theology. If the image of us down here reflects up there, and the very first thing that clarifies what that image is in Genesis is maleness and femaleness, I'm going to be very uncomfortable with anyone who tries to say there's no femininity in the divine. And that's just based on the text. Like, I'm not just importing modern progressive values. I'm trying to take seriously what Genesis says. So maybe all creationists should be divine female in this as well. If we're gonna take everything literally, like let's do it.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's great. No, that's great. I love it.
A creationist defense of the divine feminine. Like,
Yeah.
I want to see that article. I want to see that literalist.
You gotta write it. You gotta write it. Yeah.
So
I mean, yeah, you're absolutely right. And there's a lot of good work done in the biblical text to show the need for thinking about God in both male and masculine and feminine terms. And so yeah, I mean, I think there's plenty of biblical warrant for that. And we don't even need to get into the way that Hebrew and Greek words are gendered, because I don't think that's that helpful.
Yeah. I mean, I'll use it to win an argument, but I agree.
Yeah, the Spirit shifted genders from one testament to the other. It went from feminine to neuter, so from she to it. But yeah, so okay, that's good. I also want to talk to you about your argument, or Vlad's argument in the book, for the Trinity as being the grounds for embracing diversity. Obviously, there's the what's sometimes called like the social Trinity, and different theologians really have championed that. You think of people like Moltmann, and when I was at St. Andrews, I got to meet and hear from John Webster before he passed, and he was not a fan of the social Trinity whatsoever. But in any case, the connection between thinking about the Trinity in its ontology and thinking about how God's expressed in the economy of salvation and what that means for humans, for how we think about ourselves in relation to one another. I think there's obviously a lot of good fruit to be done there, regardless. So I'm not a partisan. I don't have a dog in this fight. I know some people do, but I'd love to just hear you kind of lay out your argument for why you think, because I mean, we do live at a time where there's probably more awareness of diversity than ever before, and of wanting to value that, even as we're grappling with the ways in which cultures have minimized diversity, or suppressed diversity, or disenfranchised certain groups of people depending on race, ethnicity, ability, gender, and so on and so forth. So there's obviously a lot of good reason for theologians to want to do constructive work around diversity. And so I think people would be interested to hear from you a little bit, just in terms of the Trinity as grounds for embrace of diversity. So
well, I think it comes down to ontology, which is a phrase I'll just hear me constantly talk about, because I'm connected to the New Trinitarian Ontologies project. So again, self-promotion. It comes down to ontology, which is a way of thinking I think most of us aren't really used to. But when we're talking about the underlying ontology of existence, I think ontology can ultimately be one, or it can be many, or it can be both. At the heart of everything, oneness can be uniting everything in a sort of monism, where everything is ultimately one, and diversity, difference, otherness, disagreement, relationships, all of those things are actually illusions. Everything is ultimately one. And I mean, you'll get that in not A lot of people would say you get that in Hindu thought, but you get that within one very specific camp, Advaita Vedanta, and then the New Age movement happens to be deeply influenced by that. So that's what everyone in the West thinks of the Eastern world. But you get that as sort of a very monistic thing where everything is ultimately one. Diversity, difference, otherness, relationship, those are illusions. There's just oneness, just the self, which is you, which is divine, which is everything. And in that scheme, I have never heard a really decent account of how diversity is anything other than an aberration or an illusion. Um, in that scheme, they can sometimes you'll hear people say, "Well, we're all one. That's why we should love everyone who is different from us."
Yeah.
And I get that. I get what they're saying, but that actually means we have to annihilate difference and otherness in order. Like everything needs to be same and one and homogenous in order for us to be okay with each other. So it's not I'm okay with difference. It's I will annihilate difference and all is one.
Interesting.
There is no genuine otherness. There is no other or mysterious thing that goes beyond the periphery of me. I am absolute. And so I think oneness in that scheme negates diversity, or at least makes it illusory. And I think it undermines the diversity that people think it supports. Now, you could then go the other way, which is to say, there is no oneness at the ontological foundation and root of existence. All is manyness, diversity, difference, otherness, without any unifying thread or thing to tie it all together. And if you want to say what the stereotype of postmodernity is, I don't, postmodernism is so broadly diverse and postmodernism so against defining what a thing's essence is that it's really hard to say what postmodernism is. But if we're going to stereotypically say what postmodernism is, it's the embrace of diversity, difference, otherness, and manyness writ large, with no underlying meta-narrative or oneness that brings it all back together again. And in such a structure, sure, you have an embrace of diversity, and people can often think, okay, we've deconstructed all of your social constructs that enchain and restrict and repress people and break us into different categories and hierarchies of good and bad. And so by embracing manyness and otherness and diversity, we're allowing people to love everyone regardless of whether they fit into your box, because anything goes. And all, embrace whatever you are. And there's obviously something very legit about that. And a totalizing, homogenizing oneness would negate all of those things. That's my whole point about monism and absolute oneness. However, if you swing to the other extreme, I think you also make a similar mistake, because the embrace of absolute diversity is ultimately kind of a nihilism. It means that there is no ultimate meta-narrative of goodness, such that you cannot even say people should embrace diversity. Because to say people should embrace diversity is to impose a totalizing narrative upon the manyness as a whole. And you can't do that, because then you're trying to bind the manyness with a oneness again, a moral standard of goodness that imposes itself upon all peoples. And so I think any sort of morally binding thing requires a oneness that ties people together, regardless of their different times, places, and cultures. Sorry, were you going to speak? I cut you off.
No, we keep going. Yeah, no,
yeah.
Go. You're on a roll.
And so, if everything is many, then you can't say that slavery is bad in every context. You can just say, we didn't like it in this context, but we can't speak for other contexts, because there's no one unifying thread that overarches and goes beyond to every single context everywhere. We don't have a oneness that underlies everything. We just have a plurality of manynesses and social constructs. And so if you go with oneness or with manyness, you kind of negate diversity. But the beauty of the Trinity, to me at least, is that it kind of says both. One and many. One and three. Monotheism, that's also diversity. That's also the Father, Son, and Spirit. One and three. many and yet also a unity, a plurality, and a oneness at the same time. And that's the irreconcilable paradox at the heart of existence that you're not going to dig deeper into or explain any more basically than its own terms of it's both.
Mhm.
And I don't think Christians can really explain how to make sense of it being both one and three, both one and diverse, many and yet unified. And yet, I don't think anyone can explain how like I don't think monism can explain how we got here. I don't
Mhm.
think it can explain time either. Like I don't think anyone can explain these things. So if everybody's account is absurd, why don't we pick the absurdity that best makes sense of reality and ethics and all these other areas? Why don't we pick the triune absurdity that allows for unity and diversity, oneness and manyness, and says, yeah, diversity is real, but we also have a unified meta narrative that says why it is good to embrace diversity. Um, and so I think the Trinity allows us to hold all these things in tension. I think it's the proper rectifier to an overly communal account or an overly individualistic account, holding those things in tension because it's oneness in community, individual in other, but neither of those two swallow each other up.
Hmm.
So
Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting argument to be. Um, I mean, I obviously find it compelling, but I'm a Christian as well, so I'd be interested to to hear what people from other faith traditions think. But I think it's it gets at a fundamental problem that we're constantly wrestling with as a larger society or even a global society, right? Of how do we live with one another peaceably and embrace one another, allow for differences without wiping them out, but at the same time, like, what's to say which things like we can appeal to some kind of general sense of innate morality that we all share somehow, but now we're moving towards uh that monism, right? Or
yeah,
if we move away from it, like recognize it's all contingent, then there's really nothing to say, well, as happens when we have like global crises and people start writing statements and pronouncements and all of these kind of things, none of those things really make sense unless there's some
yeah,
actual account of morality, right? You could say they're pragmatic exercises or exercises in uh articulating their perspective, right? But that's about all you can do. So yeah,
yeah.
yeah, that's interesting. Well, hey, anything else just about the book or anything else you want to share with us before we kind of wrap up?
Uh, I mean, I would just restate the title. Monotheism.
MonoThreeism,
Buy
yeah,
it.
yeah, get it.
I mean, yeah, I want people to buy it. I think because it's written at a popular level, it it gives you the impression that I'm not trying to make a bold academic claim. I'm like trying to solve everything here in a way that you haven't been allowed to do since Hegel. So it would be great if some academics responded because I'm really trying to shoot for the moon.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
so yeah,
yeah, but it's fun, it's engaging. It's yeah, I mean, you got to put your thinking cap on for sure, but like it's a great way to kind of usher people into this complex conversation, and I think you do a really nice job, laying stuff out and just carrying the conversation forward. So
yeah.
yeah,
Well, thank you for having me and for
yeah,
talking about
absolutely.
it.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. Appreciate you. Thanks.
yeah.
Thanks so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please make sure you subscribe using the link below and check out some more of our videos.